The rain had been coming down all evening, soaking the narrow street and washing the dust into dark rivulets that ran toward the gutters. The house sat at the very end of the cul-de-sac, lights off, curtains drawn tight, as though guarding a secret no one was meant to see. Neighbors had grown uneasy for days. Whispers about not seeing the family outside, the mailbox stuffed, the dog barking through the nights until it finally went silent. It was only when a relative tried calling and received no answer that the police were dispatched for a welfare check. What awaited them was unlike anything the small town had ever witnessed. The officers pushed through the front door, the stale air wrapping around them in a suffocating grip. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken locks or shattered windows. Inside, the house was eerily neat, dishes still stacked in the sink, a half-finished puzzle on the dining room table. The ordinary details made the silence all the more sinister. They moved deeper, their flashlights cutting through the heavy dark. That was when they heard it. A faint crackle, a distorted hiss, and then unmistakably a human scream. The sound came from the basement. It wasn't live. It couldn't be live. The scream looped, jagged and raw, as though someone had pressed play on an old cassette. The officers followed the noise, hearts pounding. The basement door creaked open slowly, revealing steps that descended into shadows. Each step closer made the sound sharper, until finally they reached the concrete floor below. In the center of the room sat a tape recorder, an old model with cracked plastic casing. The reels spun slowly, playing back a chilling sequence. First, a heavy breathing, then a woman's terrified voice, then a scream so piercing it made the officers freeze in place. One of them, a veteran of 20 years, admitted later that he had never heard such raw panic in a human voice. Their flashlights swept across the room and landed on what no one could have prepared for: bodies. 4 of them, laid out against the far wall, stiff and cold. A father, a mother, 2 children, their eyes open, mouths frozen mid-shout, as though the horror of their final moments had been carved into their faces. Blood pooled beneath them, congealed now, staining the concrete. But what made it worse was the position. They weren't scattered or slumped randomly. They had been arranged, carefully, like grotesque mannequins placed for display. The tape recorder kept playing, that same scream echoing again and again, bouncing off the walls until it seemed to come from every direction. The officers turned it off, but silence didn't bring comfort. In fact, the silence felt even heavier, as if the walls themselves had soaked in the cries of the dead. One officer radioed for backup, his voice shaking as he gave the address. Another examined the tape. There were multiple tracks on it, not just the scream. When he fast-forwarded, more sounds bled through, the father's deep voice begging, a child crying, something crashing in the background, then the mother shouting for help, and finally, the same scream, the one they had first heard, the one that kept looping, like the killer wanted to immortalize their terror. Who had set the tape recorder there? Who wanted the police or whoever found the family to listen to their last moments? It was deliberate, cold, calculated. Upstairs, neighbors had gathered outside, watching the red and blue lights flash against the rain-slick street. They whispered to one another, remembering the family's last normal day. The father had gone to work as usual. The mother had been seen walking the children home from school. No arguments, no disturbances, just silence, until silence became suspicion. Detectives arrived, their expressions hard as they descended into the basement. They took in the sight, the blood, the recorder. One of them crouched down, studying the machine as if it were the key to the entire mystery. "He wanted us to hear them die," the detective murmured. The thought chilled everyone in the room. Evidence techs began photographing everything, their cameras flashing against the grim tableau. Each click felt intrusive, like it disturbed something sacred. But the truth had to be documented, no matter how grotesque. The recorder was bagged carefully, every fingerprint, every smudge important. The bodies were covered, but the image of their twisted faces stayed etched in every officer's memory. Outside, the storm continued, rattling the trees and dripping from the eaves. The tape's screams still echoed in their heads, a sound no one could escape. Already theories swirled. Was it a robbery gone wrong? No valuables seemed missing. A personal grudge. The precision of the crime suggested more than rage. It suggested ritual, a performance designed to leave behind an audience. As the night deepened, the detectives promised the neighbors answers, but privately, none of them were sure they could deliver. The killer hadn't just taken lives. He had left behind a message, one that seemed to whisper through the static of the tape. I was here, I controlled this, and you'll never find me. The basement light flickered once before going dark, leaving only the storm's growl outside, and in the minds of everyone who had stepped foot into that house, the scream would never stop playing. The following morning, the house was sealed off with yellow tape, but curiosity had already pulled the neighborhood into a frenzy. Reporters crowded the street, cameras flashing, their voices sharp as they tried to capture any glimpse of what had happened inside. People whispered theories as if they had been there themselves, talk of cults, of a deranged stalker, of a family secret that had finally surfaced. No one truly knew, and that ignorance only made the horror feel larger. Inside, the investigative team worked methodically. The basement had become the epicenter of their focus, though every corner of the house was combed for answers. Forensic officers traced bloody footprints that led only to the victims, but curiously vanished at the stairwell, as though the killer had floated away. No fingerprints, no signs of struggle outside that confined room. Only the tape recorder stood as the chilling centerpiece. Detective Henry Calhoun, a man with lines etched deep into his face from decades of staring at crime scenes, sat at the dining table upstairs with the recorder in front of him. A technician had set it to rewind. The detective's hand hovered over the play button before pressing it, and the room filled again with the muffled voices of the family. Please, please don't, the father's voice pleaded. The mother's sobs overlapped, followed by the high-pitched cries of a child. Then a loud crash, furniture, maybe a chair, being overturned. The killer never spoke, not once, only silence on his end. And finally the scream. Calhoun stopped the tape and rubbed his temples. The silence of the killer unnerved him more than words ever could. A man who wanted to be heard would taunt, would shout, would revel in the violence. But this was someone who wanted his victim's fear to tell the story for him. At the local morgue, the coroner confirmed what the detective had already suspected. Each member of the family had died from precise, deliberate knife wounds. Not frenzied, not reckless, methodical, each cut delivered with the intention to cause terror before the end. The youngest, a boy no older than 8, had been killed last. The time of death suggested the murders stretched across nearly an hour. Whoever had done this had taken his time. Back at the station, the tape recorder was examined in detail. It wasn't new. Dust and scratches suggested it had been used before. The tape itself was a reused cassette, the kind someone might have recorded music on years ago. On the reverse side of the reel, faint traces of an old song could be heard, though warped and ghostly. Someone had taped over it to capture the screams. That single fact twisted every stomach in the room. The killer hadn't just stumbled upon a recorder. He had prepared it, planned this, and wanted the final moments preserved like a trophy. By midday, interviews began. Neighbors claimed the family had been ordinary. The father worked in finance, the mother part-time at a bookstore. The children were bright, cheerful, loved at school. No financial troubles, no feuds, nothing that screamed motive. But one neighbor did recall something peculiar. 3 nights before the murders, a figure had been spotted standing across the street, watching the house. Tall, motionless, almost blending into the darkness.
The neighbor had dismissed it as paranoia, a trick of the light. Now she wondered if she had seen the killer waiting. Detective Calhoun sent officers canvassing the area, checking cameras from nearby stores, traffic lights, anything that could have captured a stranger lurking around. But the early results were frustratingly empty. Whoever this was, he had been careful. Late that evening, Calhoun returned to the crime scene, walking through the silent house. He studied the puzzle on the dining room table, the mugs on the counter, the little shoes by the front door. It was a home frozen in time, interrupted by violence. Something gnawed at him. The way the bodies had been arranged. They weren't simply laid out. The mother's arm had been stretched toward her children, the father positioned slightly apart, facing the wall, almost like a twisted tableau, as though the killer wanted to send a message. He went back to the basement and stared at the cold concrete where the blood had dried into dark stains. The chalk outline seemed too fragile against the weight of what had occurred there. He looked again at the spot where the recorder had been found. It was placed perfectly in the middle, angled so that anyone who entered would notice it first. The killer wanted it to be discovered. He wanted someone to press play. The thought made Calhoun shudder. This wasn't just murder. This was performance. A stage set for an audience. And the audience wasn't just the police. It was anyone who would hear the tape in the future. Back at headquarters, the tape was digitized to preserve every second. During one playback, a technician noticed something strange. Underneath the chaos of screams and sobs, there was another sound, faint, almost inaudible, a steady tapping, rhythmic like a pattern. When isolated, it seemed deliberate, as though the killer had been tapping a finger against the recorder's casing while he worked. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps again, a signal, a code. The discovery set the room buzzing. If it was intentional, the killer had left a signature. If it was unintentional, then it was a glimpse into his state of mind. Either way, it was a clue. That night, Detective Calhoun couldn't sleep. The scream replayed in his mind with brutal clarity. The silence of the killer weighed heavier than the cries of the victims. And somewhere, in the darkness of the city, the man who had orchestrated this was listening too, maybe to the tape, maybe to the news coverage, satisfied that his performance had left the world unsettled. The storm had passed, but inside Calhoun, a storm had just begun. He knew this wasn't the end. Killers like this didn't stop after one masterpiece. This was only the opening act.
The sun rose weakly the next morning, its light smothered by a dense haze that seemed unwilling to lift. The house at the end of the cul-de-sac looked ordinary again from the outside, its white siding gleaming faintly under the gray sky. But inside the police station, the horror of what had been uncovered was still fresh, replaying in every detective's mind. Detective Henry Calhoun sat in the dimly lit briefing room, with a stack of files in front of him. Coffee sat untouched at his elbow. The tape had been replayed a dozen times through the night, each time bringing a new detail into focus. The team was exhausted, but obsession clung to them. The scream, the cries, the silence of the killer, ignored at every man and woman in the room. A young technician named Marlowe shuffled in, her eyes red from lack of sleep. "We've enhanced the background audio further," she said, sliding a USB drive onto the table. "There's more than just tapping. Listen closely." Calhoun inserted the drive and pressed play. The familiar sequence began, the father's pleading, the mother's cries, the crash of something heavy. But then in the seconds, just before the scream, there was something faint, almost like music. The team leaned forward, straining. It was low, distorted, barely audible under the chaos, but it was there, a melody, a piano, hesitant and uneven, as though played by someone unpracticed. Just a handful of notes, repeated before being swallowed by the scream. "What the hell is that?" muttered one of the officers. Marlowe spoke softly, almost whispering. "It's a children's song. A lullaby. I ran it through software. It matches fragments of a traditional tune used in old music boxes. Good night, my darling." The room fell silent. The killer hadn't just wanted to record fear. He had wanted to lace it with something intimate, something meant to pierce deeper than any scream could. The juxtaposition of innocence and horror. Calhoun's jaw tightened. He's orchestrating this. Every detail. He's building a stage. Later that afternoon, the autopsy reports arrived. They were clinical, detached, but their details painted an even grimmer picture. The victims hadn't been killed quickly. There were defensive wounds on the father's arms, bruises on the mother where she had fought back, small cuts on the children suggesting restraint. The killer had controlled the pace, prolonging their fear before the final strikes. He hadn't just wanted them dead, he wanted them to suffer. What disturbed Calhoun most was the timing. Based on stomach contents, the family had been killed between 9 and 11 p.m., but neighbors swore they had heard nothing. No screams, no breaking glass, nothing but the dog barking for a few minutes before going quiet. So how had a whole family been slaughtered in their own home, with screams loud enough to shake the walls captured on tape, and yet no one outside had heard a thing? That question weighed on him as he drove back to the crime scene. The house was empty now, its windows dark. He unlocked the door and stepped into the silence. Every creak of the floorboard echoed in his ears. He walked through the rooms again, touching nothing, only observing. The puzzle still sat unfinished on the table. He stared at it for a long time. A picture of a lighthouse at sea, the pieces forming the stormy water, the jagged rocks, the faint outline of the tower. The father had likely been the one working on it. Neighbors said he enjoyed puzzles, but one piece lay on the floor, deliberately placed. Calhoun bent down and picked it up. The piece was dark, almost black. Part of the night sky. Written on its back in smeared ink was a symbol, 3 small vertical lines and a slash through them. His chest tightened. The killer had left something behind, not just the tape. This too, a signature. He bagged the piece carefully and hurried back to the station. When he showed Marlowe, her eyes widened. That's not random, that's intentional. He's leaving breadcrumbs. Meanwhile, patrol officers knocked on more doors, expanding their radius beyond the immediate street. One woman, living 2 blocks away, came forward hesitantly. She had been walking home late the night of the murders, when she'd heard faint piano notes drifting through the night. At first, she thought it was a neighbor playing, but the sound had been oddly mechanical, repetitive, almost broken. Now, hearing about the murders, she was certain it had been connected. The detail matched perfectly with the background melody on the tape. By evening, Calhoun sat at his desk, staring at the puzzle piece, with its strange symbol. He sketched it on a notepad, trying to make sense of it. Was it a code, a tally, a countdown, 3 lines and a slash? 4. 4 what? 4 victims, or 4 acts in a play? His phone buzzed. It was the coroner again. "Detective, there's something you need to hear. We found residue on the victim's clothing, traces of chalk dust, white, fine, consistent. It's not from the house." The killer tracked it in. Chalk dust. A school, a church, a warehouse. Calhoun closed his eyes. The killer was weaving a story, piece by piece, and they were only beginning to glimpse the outline. But one thing was certain. The recorder wasn't meant to be the end. It was meant to be the beginning. And somewhere out there, the man who orchestrated it all was already preparing his next performance. Detective Henry Calhoun's office was littered with papers, maps and photographs tacked haphazardly onto corkboards. The puzzle piece, with its strange 3 lines and a slash, sat at the center of his desk, illuminated, under a desk lamp, like a relic of the killer's mind. He had spent hours staring at it, searching for meaning, numbers, symbols, a message only the killer could understand. The more he thought,
the clearer one thing became. This was not the killer's first act. Calhoun had seen enough murder scenes in his life to know when something was routine and when something was performance. This was the latter. The recorder, the scream, the music box melody. Now the puzzle piece with a symbol. These were staging elements, designed with precision. The killer wanted them to see, to listen, to feel, which meant somewhere, somehow, he had done it before. By midday, Calhoun ordered the cold case files pulled from storage. He asked specifically for unsolved homicides involving unusual staging, families targeted or clues left behind. Hours later, a stack of dusty files landed on his desk. He sifted through them, one by one, and his exhaustion began to fade as a pattern emerged. 5 years earlier, in a neighboring county, a couple had been found murdered in their home. Both victims had been posed, facing each other in dining chairs, hands clasped, like puppets. On the table between them sat a wind-up toy that never belonged to the family. It had been left to tick-tock endlessly, until discovered. The case had gone cold. 3 years ago, a woman was killed in her apartment. Her body had been arranged in bed, her hands folded over her chest. On her nightstand, investigators found an old tape deck. Unlike the current case, it held only static, but the presence of a recorder felt eerily similar. That case too had gone nowhere. Now this family, and the tape. Calhoun spread the files side by side, the similarities glaring. Different counties, different jurisdictions, but the same chilling undertone. A killer who left behind, not only death, but theater. And no one had ever connected the dots. Until now. He pinned the photos on his board, circling details in red. Wind-up toy, tape deck, puzzle piece, symbols. Each crime was a verse in a poem, each scene a part of a story unfolding across years. Meanwhile, the lab report on the chalk dust arrived. The composition matched a very specific type chalk used in old factories, not the softer kind used in classrooms. Industrial chalk, once common in textile warehouses. Many of those buildings had been abandoned after the economy shifted. That narrowed the search to a handful of possible locations across the city. Calhoun dispatched a small team to scout them. They found nothing at first, just decaying walls, rusted pipes, rats, scurrying through shadows. But at one warehouse, they stumbled upon something peculiar. On a concrete pillar, faint but unmistakable, was the same symbol Calhoun had found on the back of the puzzle piece. 3 lines with a slash, freshly drawn in chalk. When the team called it in, Calhoun felt a chill run down his spine. The killer had been there, maybe recent, maybe still watching. That night, Calhoun couldn't shake the sense that he was being pulled into a game. The killer was setting the stage, dropping symbols like breadcrumbs. And what terrified him most was the thought that the killer wasn't merely taunting the police. He was inviting them, urging them forward into the labyrinth he had built. Later, alone in his office, Calhoun replayed the digitized tape again. He listened not just for screams, but for the spaces in between. Silence is where killers hide their intent. He closed his eyes, focusing on the faint piano notes. The melody looped again, haunting, like a child's lullaby sung through broken teeth. And then he heard, not just tapping this time, not just music. Beneath the chaos, faint but deliberate, breathing, slow, controlled, close to the microphone. The killer had been right there, holding the recorder as he watched his victims die. Calhoun's heart pounded. This wasn't about trophies. This wasn't about evidence left behind. This was about authorship. The killer wasn't just recording screams. He was signing his work. The detective leaned back, staring at the board of photos. This isn't random, he muttered to himself. This is a series, a progression. If that was true, then the 3 lines and slash might not represent the 4 victims. It could represent the 4th act in a sequence. 4 performances already completed. 4 stages of the same symphony, which meant the murders weren't ending here. They were building towards something larger. At that very moment, miles away, in the quiet of another unsuspecting neighborhood, a man sat in a darkened room, with an old tape recorder in his lap. He wound a fresh cassette, his hands steady, his breathing calm. On the table beside him, lay a box of chalk and a children's music box. He smiled faintly as the gears clicked. The next performance was already being prepared.
The night was quiet in the suburbs, the kind of silence where every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of leaves outside a window seemed amplified. In one particular house, a young couple settled their toddler into bed. The child's small music box, painted with faded stars, chimed softly, playing a lullaby. The parents kissed their son goodnight, not knowing that they were being watched. Across the street, in the shadow of an old oak tree, a man stood still, his breath steady, his eyes fixed on the house. He had been watching them for weeks, studying their routines, learning their movements. He knew when the lights went out, when the husband left for work, when the wife stepped onto the porch with her morning coffee. Every detail had been absorbed, filed away, rehearsed in his mind like stage directions. At midnight, the man moved. He wore gloves, dark clothing, and carried nothing that would shine in the moonlight. He approached the back of the house, slipping a thin tool from his pocket. Within seconds, the lock on the sliding glass door gave way. The sound was softer than the hum of the refrigerator inside. He didn't rush. He never rushed. He stepped inside, his shoes soundless against the hardwood floor. The tape recorder in his satchel pressed against his side, waiting, always waiting. Upstairs, the couple slept. The toddler stirred in his crib, a whimper catching in his throat, as if sensing the shadow that had entered their home. The intruder paused at the child's door, gazing in. His hand rested briefly on the recorder. Not yet. The boy wasn't his focus tonight. He turned away, heading for the parents' bedroom. When the sun rose, the house was silent again, but in a way it had never been before. The following morning, Detective Henry Calhoun was woken by a call. His phone buzzed angrily against the nightstand, dragging him from a shallow sleep. He answered, his voice rough. The words on the other end jolted him upright. Another family, same staging, same recorder. Within an hour, Calhoun was at the scene. The street looked heartbreakingly familiar. Another ordinary cul-de-sac, another ordinary family. But inside, the nightmare unfolded in grim echoes of the previous case. The parents lay lifeless in their bed, positioned side by side, their hands clasped. A tape recorder sat on the dresser, its reels still spinning, capturing the silence of the empty room. After the violence was over, Calhoun's stomach twisted as he scanned the room. This wasn't a copycat. This was the same man, escalating, refining his performance. He moved to the child's room, bracing himself. The boy was alive, shaken, crying, but alive, left untouched in his crib. Calhoun felt a chill so sharp it nearly buckled him. Twice now, children had been spared, not out of mercy. He knew that much. It was deliberate. It was design. But why? The tape was bagged, and the team listened to it back at the station. This one was different. It began not with chaos, but with silence. Then the faint click of a door, footsteps, breathing, then the father's startled voice, followed by a single plea before being cut short. The mother screamed, but her cries were muffled quickly, and then came the lullaby, played louder this time, clearer, almost proud, the same melody as before. When the screaming ended, the breathing remained, slow and measured, and then, for the first time, the killer spoke. A single phrase, whispered into the recorder. 4 lines, 1 slash. The room went cold. Calhoun stared at the waveform on the screen. The voice etched into it, calm, controlled, confident, the same phrase as the symbol on the puzzle piece. The killer had confirmed it himself. Marlowe leaned over the audio file, her face pale. He's counting. Counting what? An officer asked. Calhoun didn't answer immediately. His mind replayed every symbol, every body, every recording, a tally. Each act marked, each family a chapter. The line and slash weren't random.
They were progress markers in a series, and if this was the fourth, then it meant one chilling truth. This wasn't the end. That night, Calhoun sat in his office, staring at the puzzle piece again. His reflection glared back at him from the glass covering the evidence board. Families, recordings, symbols, all pieces of a macabre performance. He realized something that made his chest tighten. The killer wasn't just leaving messages for the police. He was building anticipation. He was writing a story in blood and fear. And Calhoun and his team were the unwilling audience. Each murder wasn't an endpoint. It was a prologue to something larger. And now the killer had spoken directly, breaking his silence. He wanted them to hear him. He wanted them to know he was keeping score. Somewhere in the city, another cassette was being prepared. Another house was already marked. Calhoun leaned forward, whispering to himself, as if to the phantom breathing in the tape. What are you building, and how do I stop you before the final act? But in the darkness beyond the city lights, the killer smiled, because the detective had finally asked the right question. The city seemed to pulse with unease. In the days that followed the second family's murder, news outlets ran constant coverage, replaying the same few grim details. Ordinary homes, innocent families, tape recorders capturing their last moments. Neighbors were locking their doors earlier, drawing curtains tight, whispering to each other in hushed voices at grocery stores. A shadow had settled over the community, and no one trusted the dark anymore. Detective Henry Calhoun hadn't slept in more than 40 hours. His office was a shrine of horror. Photographs of the two crime scenes pinned beside older cold case files, puzzle pieces circled in red marker, a crudely drawn timeline scratched across the whiteboard. At the center of it all, written in thick black ink, was the killer's phrase, 4 lines, 1/. Calhoun stared at it until the words blurred, then his phone buzzed. It was Marlo from the audio. We isolated something new from the second tape, she said, her voice trembling with adrenaline. You need to hear this. Minutes later, Calhoun was in the lab. Marlo cued the recording, fast-forwarding past the screams, the lullaby, the whisper of 4 lines, 1/. She tapped the waveform on the screen. Not a doorbell, not a clock. Clearer, sharper, like the bell of a bicycle. Calhoun frowned. A bicycle? Marlo nodded. I cross-checked. It's the exact pitch of a vintage bicycle bell, mid-20th century. You can't mistake it. Why would that sound be on the tape? Unless the killer wanted it there. Another breadcrumb. That same afternoon, while officers canvassed neighborhoods near the second crime scene, a boy came forward. He was only 12. His voice shaky as he told the story. The night of the murder, he had been sneaking out to meet a friend, when he saw something on the corner near the cul-de-sac. A man on a bicycle, not a modern one, an old-fashioned bike, with curved handlebars and a large front light. The man hadn't pedaled quickly. He rode slowly, deliberately, his head turning toward the street, where the family lived. The boy had ducked into the shadows, too frightened to get a good look at his face. But he remembered one thing. The man had stopped at the corner, looked up at the house, and tapped his bell. Then he rode off into the night. Calhoun's pulse quickened. The bell wasn't accidental, it was intentional. The killer wanted it preserved on the recording, just like the tapping, just like the lullaby. Another signature in his symphony. By evening, a break finally came. Forensic techs, analyzing the chalk dust from the second scene, found something different. Tiny metallic flakes mixed in. The particles matched the composition of old bicycle gears, the kind used in bikes manufactured decades ago. Bicycles, chalk, tape recorders, Calhoun muttered, staring at the evidence board. He's building this out of relics, out of forgotten pieces of the past. The realization unsettled him. This killer wasn't just a murderer. He was an archivist of terror, curating his crimes with objects from another time, weaving nostalgia into nightmares. That night, a task force was deployed. Officers scoured antique shops, flea markets, pawn stores, anywhere an old bicycle or tape recorder might pass through. Dozens of shop owners were interviewed. Most shrugged. But one man, an antiques dealer near the river, offered a detail that froze Calhoun's blood. Yes, I sold an old bicycle last month. A rally. 1950s, to a man quiet, polite, paid in cash, asked specifically for something classic, said he was building a collection. Calhoun pressed, "Do you remember anything about him?" The dealer hesitated, then nodded. He wore gloves in the middle of summer, and he hummed, while he browsed, a children's tune, "Gave me the chills," a lullaby. Calhoun left the shop, with a lead for the first time, a description, a window into the killer's habits. It wasn't much, but it was a threat. Back at the station, he spread the details across his board. 2 families slaughtered, a child spared each time, tape recorders capturing their final moments, symbols of progress left behind, now bicycles, bells, chalk, lullaby. The killer was layering his performances, folding in more and more props. As the clock struck midnight, Calhoun leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pressing down but adrenaline holding him awake. He knew the killer was out there, watching the coverage, savoring the chaos. He also knew the man was planning the next performance, and somewhere, in a dimly lit room, the killer wound another tape into a recorder. He placed a chalk-drawn symbol on the wall beside him. 5 lines, 2 slashes. His hand brushed the bicycle bell, resting on the table. Then softly, he began to hum the lullaby again.
Rain hammered against the glass of the precinct windows as Detective Calhoun paced the floor, the ticking clock on the wall gnawing at his nerves. The chalk mark from the killer's last scene had burned itself into his brain. 5 lines, 2 slashes. He had been charting them against dates, against the murders, against the rising body count. Each symbol wasn't random. They were measures in a song. The killer wasn't just documenting, he was composing. Then the call came through. A frantic neighbor on the east side reported hearing strange noises through her walls, an old song, like a nursery rhyme, faint but unmistakable. She had pressed her ear to the plaster and swore she heard children crying, and the ring of a bell. Calhoun didn't wait for backup. He grabbed his coat and gun, his body moving before his mind could catch up. The address was a decrepit row house by the river, its windows dark, its paint peeling like old skin. The front door creaked open at his push. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and dust. The faint hum of a tape recorder drifted from upstairs, low and deliberate. He drew his gun, each step groaning under his weight as he climbed the staircase. The hallway at the top was lit by a single bare bulb. Doors lined either side, but only one leaked, the glow of a desk lamp. The sound of the lullaby grew louder, warping slightly as the tape dragged across worn reels. Calhoun steadied himself and shoved the door open. The room looked like a museum of nightmares. Antique bicycles leaned against the wall. Chalk symbols covered every surface, and shelves were lined with dozens of tape recorders. Some were labeled with dates, others bore names. All had reels wound and ready. At the center sat the killer, a thin figure in a dark coat, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a brimmed hat. He didn't flinch when Calhoun entered. He simply pressed the recorder's stop button, the lullaby cutting off mid-note. "I knew you'd come," the man said, his voice calm, almost teacher-like. "You've been listening to my work, detective. Do you hear it yet? The rhythm. Hands where I can see them." Calhoun barked, his gun trained steady. "Step away from the table." The man chuckled softly. No, no, no. You don't interrupt the final act. It ruins the symmetry." He reached for something beside the recorder, a small brass bell. He tapped it once. The metallic chime echoed through the room. Calhoun's pulse pounded. "I said step back." The killer stood slowly, turning just enough for Calhoun to see his pale, angular features, eyes lit with manic devotion. Every scream, every sob, every silence, it all fits. A family's accords. When one is silenced, the dissonance becomes harmony. He tapped the bell again. That sound was followed by a faint whimper. Calhoun's gaze darted left. In the corner of the room,
Inside a wooden playpen sat a baby, no more than a year old, its cheeks streaked with tears, the only survivor, waiting to be written into the killer's score. Rage surged through Calhoun. Move away from the child. The killer tilted his head. You don't understand. The child is the note that carries forward. Without it, the song ends too soon. Suddenly, his hand darted, not for the bell, but for a knife gleaming on the desk. Calhoun fired, the shot deafening in the confined room. The man staggered, the knife clattering to the floor, but instead of collapsing, he stumbled toward the nearest tape recorder. Blood smeared across his coat as he pressed the record button. "This is the last scream," he whispered. Then he laughed. Even as his body buckled, Calhoun rushed forward, kicking the knife aside and tearing the recorder from the man's hands. The killer slumped against the wall, his breath shallow but his eyes alight with satisfaction, as though death itself was just another measure in his twisted symphony. "Tell me, detective," he rasped, coughing blood. "When the tape plays back, will you hear me, or yourself?" And then he was gone, his final smile frozen, the room still echoing with the faint ring of the bell. Calhoun stood there trembling, the baby's cries filling the silence. He picked the child up gently, staring at the shelves of tapes surrounding him. So many reels, so many lives, each one captured like insects pinned to a board. Evidence, yes, but also a legacy the killer had orchestrated with meticulous care. Outside, sirens wailed closer, backup finally arriving. Calhoun carried the baby down the stairs, his mind heavy with a realization that chilled him deeper than the night air. Even in death, the killer had left him a question with no answer, because somewhere, in the chaos of reels and recordings, the music wasn't finished. The rain outside had slowed, but inside the precinct, the weight of the night lingered like smoke that refused to clear. The baby slept in a blanket on the desk, a fragile reminder that life had survived where death had claimed everything else. The shelves of tape recorders had been hauled in, stacked like coffins of sound, each reel waiting to spill its horrors back into the world. Detective Calhoun sat with his head in his hands, replaying the killer's last words over and over, hearing them in the hum of the lights, in the soft tick of the wall clock, even in the faint rustle of the baby's breathing. He wondered if he had really stopped the nightmare, or if he had simply stepped into another verse of it. Somewhere, in those reels, he knew, were the screams of families erased forever, their last moments trapped in magnetic lines that would outlive them all. Somewhere, in those recordings, was the rhythm the killer had spoken of, a rhythm Calhoun feared he was beginning to hear himself. And as dawn crept across the horizon, one truth settled heavy in his chest. Monsters do not vanish with a single bullet. They echo through the stories they leave behind, through the lives they shatter, through the silence that